prisons are overcrowded, meeting the minimum standard for food and water can be quite challenging unless budgets are increased and the capacity of the kitchen and the water supply is increased also. Next slide, please. And overcrowding, as I said, is a key issue, and the rules are very clear that accommodation should be provided with sufficient space, heating and ventilation, and minimum floor space should be provided without exception. And increasingly in the region, we are seeing overcrowded prisons where detainees are not having sufficient space to live in. And in fact, in some places, there's even having some sort of rota system for sleeping on the floor because there's not sufficient space for all detainees to sleep on the floor. So really important under the Mandela rules, Rule 12 to 14, I've written it there, that there is sufficient accommodation space for detainees. Next slide, please. I talked earlier around the importance of contact with the outside world, and there's a huge amount of research that says that detainees who are able to maintain contact with their family resettle much more positively and are much less likely to commit future offending. It's really important that prisons facilitate contact with the outside world, and that's set out then in rules 43 and 58 to 60. So that detainees should be able to receive visits and make contact with their families through telephones, through letters. These days, some prison systems in the region allow video conferencing with families, allow families to talk to detainees through things like WhatsApp or Line or Telegraph, so different ways to maintain contact. But important to maintain regular contact with family. And again, restrictions on visits should not be used as a disciplinary measure, particularly for women and their children. And detainees should have a right to tell people where they are. There should not be disappearance into the prison system. So that the UN standards make clear that detainees should have the right to inform their family which prison they're locked up in, where they're located, so that the prison can so the family can maintain contact. Okay, next slide, please. Physical and mental health. We've touched on about not making detainees worse from both a physical and a mental point of view. And the UN standards, again, make clear that healthcare in the prison should be at the same standard to healthcare offered in the community. So that means whatever happens in the community should happen within doctors in the community. There should be doctors in the prison. If there are nurses and clinics in the community, there should be nurses and clinics in prisons, and detainees should be able to access those health facilities very easily. There should not be artificial restrictions stopping detainees accessing health personnel within the prison. And that's set out in Rule 24 and 29 of the Mandela Rules. Moving on now to safety and security, and the first rule, rule number 1, is that safety and security of prisoners, staff, service providers, and visitors shall be ensured at all times. So again, it's about looking after human life, protecting human safety. So rule 1 in the Mandela Rules is prison authorities should take appropriate measures to protect the safety and security of everyone entering into a prison. Next slide, thank you. Well, we know not all prisoners will behave themselves. I mean, some detainees will break the rules. Some detainees will misbehave. So the UN standards acknowledge that. They set out in Rule 54 and 55 that detainees should know what the rules are. So they should be told when they arrive what the rules are, what their rights and obligations are, and what the disciplinary sanction should be. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to detainees if they're breaking a rule. They should know they're breaking the rule. So information must be provided in a language that they understand. And if they can't read, the rules should be explained to the detainees. And as I said, the disciplinary offences should be very clear, and they must define what is a disciplinary offence. Slide, please. Again, the UN rules, Rule 43 and 47 and 49, say that instruments of restraint that are inherently degrading or painful are prohibited. So you can't use some instrument of restraint if they are degrading or painful. Other restraints can be used, but only if it's based on a risk assessment. So it should not be automatic. It should be based on the security needs to use some forms of restraints, and that restraints should be removed where they're no longer needed. And as I mentioned earlier, use of force is in Rule 82, should only be used in self-defense or attempted escape. And only minimum force should be used with detainees, and only when strictly necessary to enforce the rules. Next slide, please. I just want to highlight the issue of solitary confinement, and as you'll see from that, Rule 43, 46 of the UN rules, the Mandela rules, refer to solitary confinement, and highlight that solitary confinement can have a very negative impact on someone's physical and mental health, and should only be used as a last resort. And importantly, that indefinite and prolonged solitary confinement, which is defined as more than 15 days, should be prohibited entirely, and that solitary confinement should be not be used particularly for pregnant women or breastfeeding women. And that even if somebody's in solitary confinement, it should not last for more than 22 hours per day, which means that somebody should have the opportunity to come out of their room and get some fresh air and be outside and have the opportunity to shower. So quite clear rules on the use of solitary confinement. Next slide, please. The UN standards accept that searching should take place and sets out in Rule 50 to 53 and 60 that there should be clear procedures. Detainees should know again what those procedures are, and that if searchings take place, it should be done with respect for the dignity and privacy of the detainee, of the prisoner, and it should not be used to harass or intimidate detainees. And internal searches, so invasive body searches, should only be used as a last resort, and the findings of the search need to be recorded to show there's good reason for undertaking an internal body search. And lots of countries now are using technology rather than doing invasive body searches. And again, visitors to the prison can be searched, but must be subject to the same safeguards as for detainees. Okay, next slide, please. Admission to the prison, so there needs to be a good system of registration. So the prison director, the head of the prison, should know exactly who's in the prison. They should know details about the person. There should be a file, and it should record things like any visible injuries or complaints about prior ill treatment on arriving in the prison. And that's to protect the prison authorities and prison staff if somebody's alleging that they were assaulted prior to arriving in the prison. So a good record. There should also be effective medical screening on arrival, particularly to identify any issues for the detainee, but also to protect the rest of the prison to make sure the detainee doesn't have any contagious diseases. And obviously that's particularly true during current times of COVID-19 to limit and reduce the spread of COVID. But it also applies to things like TB, scabies, a number of other contagious diseases. So a good medical screening on arrival. Next slide, please. Well, I mentioned that detainees should be told what the disciplinary rules are, but they should also be told about other information in the prison. So they should be given some sort of handbook or documentation about information in the prison. And Rules 7 and 67 say that any property that's taken off the detainee, their clothing, any valuable goods, any personal possessions, should be stored safely in security and returned to the detainee at the end of their sentence. Next slide, please. And again, I haven't got time today to go into detail about classification, categorization, and allocation of detainees, but just want to highlight that the Nelson Mandela rules, the UN standards, say that treatment should be individualized. There should be an individual assessment of each detainee. So some detainees should be kept separate. Males should be kept separate from women. Children should be kept separate from adults. Ideally, pre-trial should be kept separate from sentenced. So that's the status of the individual. But in addition to that, there should be an individualized assessment around what the risks are. Should this person be in high security, medium security, low security? And an assessment of what their needs are. So do they need particular skills training? Do they need particular offending behavior training? So do they need some sort of therapy, some sort of cognitive behavioral programs? So an individualized assessment is highlighted as being key in the international standards. Next slide, please. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but not only when you come to designing prisons, but also the procedures, the SOPs, standard operating procedures, should take into account the special needs of detainees. And we're certainly finding in this region, in the Asia Pacific region, there's an increasing number of elderly, of older detainees who bring with them a range of both physical and mental challenges, and that can be around hearing, eyesight, mobility, the ability to move around, but also have much higher healthcare needs in general. So prisons should take into account the special needs of vulnerable groups, whether they be women, juveniles, elderly people, or a range of other detainees that are vulnerable because of their status, who may have special needs. Next slide, please. And just to highlight the point, the importance of maintaining the prison records. It's good to take the information when somebody arrives in the prison, but that file should be regularly maintained and stored safely and updated with new information about the detainee and kept in a confidential manner, so that other detainees should not have access to those files. Okay, next slide, please. And again, just to highlight something I mentioned earlier, which is the importance of education, training and work in prison. And the Mandela rules stress the importance of providing positive opportunities for detainees so they're able to improve themselves, to develop skills, to do vocational training, to learn to read and write, so that it's easier for them to get a job after their release. And that's set out in the rules I put on that slide. But also the opportunity for work. So that's not about servitude or slavery within the prison. It's about giving detainees opportunities to help maintain the prison. It might be about maintenance or construction or cleaning within the prison. So any activities that get detainees out of their rooms doing constructive things is to be welcomed and encouraged. And as I said, it's set out in the Mandela rules. Next slide, please. It's not just about educational work, day-to-day activities, so meaningful activities. By that I mean sports. Everyone's entitled to 1 hour outside of their accommodation area every day, so they can see light, see the sky. And that's set out in the Mandela rules, that everyone should have the opportunity for 1 hour per day of outdoor exercise. And I've mentioned the importance of prison education as well. Okay, next slide, please. And I don't want to leave this lecture without touching on the importance of prison staff. And I've worked in 8 prisons in the UK and visited prisons in over 30 countries around the world. And for me, it's not so much around the buildings, what it looks like, whether the building is old, how much resources the prison has got. It's much more around prison staff and the quality of prison staff and the competence and capability of those staff. So a good prison is because there are good staff. And I've seen very old prisons with very limited resources that I would still say is a good prison, because the prison staff are well motivated, well trained, well orientated. They adopt a very humanitarian approach. They treat detainees with dignity. So for me, the most important element of everything I've talked about is having good staff who recognize the importance of treating detainees with humanity and with dignity. And that's recognized in the Mandela rules. that in Rule 4748, say prison staff should be appointed on a full-time basis, and that this should be subject to a normal civil service, public service contract, and that they should be adequately paid. So making sure they have a good salary, and that having a good salary helps to reduce and stop any corruption or people receiving bribes, and also makes prison staff feel suitably rewarded for what is a very challenging job. Working in prisons is certainly one of the most difficult jobs there is, and that should be recognised, and that's covered in Rule 74. Next slide, please. Oh, back one, thank you. Yeah, I've talked around the importance of recruitment and selection, but also of training for prison staff, because prison staff need appropriate training to be able to fulfil their role in a professional way. And that's about training before they start working in the prison, but it's also about ongoing professional training. So it's not about being trained once. Regular training should take place on an ongoing basis. And one of the things ICRC is working on is an example of a modern training curriculum for prison staff, because I know a lot of prison academies in the region are looking at changing their training curriculum. And I've come to ICRC to ask for help around improving the training for prison staff and making it more modern and in line with international standards. So that's what I was going to say about the UN Standard Minimum Rules. And as I said, there are translations around that, so do please have a look at it. But they set out the minimum standards. Just before I finish, for my last couple of minutes, I just wanted to highlight some of the work that ICRC is doing in the region, working in close collaboration with prison authorities. And the work we do and what we find during our detention visits is treated as confidential. So we report it back to the head of the prison director, and to prison headquarters. But we don't go to the media, we don't leak it to NGOs. So the work we do by visiting prisons is always treated as confidential. And we talk to staff, we talk to detainees, and then report back where we see any shortfalls or areas of development to the authorities. But that's done in a confidential way. And when we visit the prison, back one. Previous slide, please. Thank you. So we visit individual prisons, so we work at prison level, but we also work at prison system level. So looking at, are there common elements across all prisons that we can help the authorities with? So I've just put on that slide 3 examples of where we've done some work in the region. So in Myanmar, we helped construct a new visiting area for detainees' families, because the visiting area in one prison was falling down. That was in Myanmar. In Cambodia, we helped to renovate some of the prison kitchens, because the cookers, the kitchens, again, were not functioning. The third example there is in the Philippines, where we helped the Philippines Authority develop their own prison design and planning manual. So it facilitated a number of workshops with them, looking at building future prisons. What should future prisons look like from a design point of view? Next slide, please. Other examples, these are around health in detention. So in Philippines, we helped with a TB control project. In Cambodia, we helped put in a new health system. And in Papua New Guinea, I worked with them to help improve access to healthcare and putting in place a monitoring of access to healthcare. Next slide, please. One of the other areas we help focus on is judicial guarantees, and by that is allowing detainees to access their legal rights. So in Sri Lanka, one of the issues is around the overcrowding, and we helped facilitate a task force between different ministries, between Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Finance, around how the authorities could reduce the level of overcrowding and set up alternatives to prison and develop new institutions. In the Philippines, we helped set up an electronic paralegal system to train prison staff to not be lawyers, but to be legal advisors, to help signpost detainees to where they could find out information to guarantee their attendance at court. So a range of things related to that. In Cambodia, we help train court clerks, again, about the Cambodian law and around using alternatives, custodial measures, not just for prisons. And lastly, last slide, or next slide, please. Just some other examples. So in Cambodia, we helped set up an education vocational training program for detainees. In Malaysia, we helped do prison staff training and supported the development of the curriculum. Myanmar, we helped drafting some legislation around a new prison law, new prison regulations and SOPs. And in Bangladesh, helped with some prison management training, and again, helping to develop the curriculum. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the end of this lecture. I just wanted to leave the last word really to Nelson Mandela, who I think summed it up after many years of being locked up in himself, when he said that no one can truly know a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but by how it treats its lowest ones. So it's around what happens in our prisons, and that's how we should be judged. And good, humane prisons, as I said, are down to good, humane prison staff who are well trained, and a prison system that is appropriately resourced, that at least meets the minimum standards that I've touched on today. Last slide, please. So thank you very much for listening so patiently. I hope you found some of that interesting. Maybe some of that was new to you. I'm more than happy to answer some questions if you have any, or indeed to hear your thoughts about what I said or other issues related to humane prisons, either in Indonesia or more broadly. So thank you very much. I hand back to our facilitators.
Thank you, sir, for the lecture. I believe your lecture will be very valuable for our education ahead. We have all learned so much from it. I think that the curious mind of our audience will have a couple of questions for you. So let's go ahead to our Q&A session. Dr. Chen, we are going to open about 3 to 5 questions from the audience. I hope that these are all right for you.
Saya, Mbak. MC.
Siap, Pak.
Number 1. Okay. Thank you. My name is Saryaliska from Poltekip, lecture, dosen. Pertanyaan singkat, bagaimana pandangan ICRC tentang pelaksanaan revitalisasi pemasyarakatan di Indonesia ditinjau dari rancang bangun, desain building, desain security, desain bangunan, desain security, dan desain perlakuan terhadap warga binaan. Number 1. And then number 2, bagaimana pandangan ICRC tentang tidak disediakannya kamar conjunction visit di lapas di Indonesia. Thank you very much. Ya, Mbak, makasih. Oke, thank you, Mbak.
Siap, Pak.
Bisa?
Excuse me, before we go to the other questions, can I ask the honorable audience to this presentation was about the general concern, the ICRC perspective for detention. ICRC is not visiting places of detention in Indonesia, so we will not be in a position to comment on what is happening in Indonesia. What we want to offer today is the general perspective, if you agree. Thank you.
So yes, thank you. Exactly right. So I've not visited prisons in Indonesia. I hope to one day. I visited many other countries in the region, so it'd be great at some point to be able to do that. It's difficult to comment specifically around Indonesian prisons, but I would just make the broad point that ICRC is working with a number of countries in the region around future prison design, because one of the things we know is that many prisons in the region are not suitable to hold detainees. They're very old prisons. They need refurbishment, they need repairing. In some cases, they need knocking down and new prisons built. So ICRC recognizes that and is working currently, I think, in 4 or 5 different prison systems in the region, supporting prison authorities on prison design, planning, and construction. And part of ICRC, we have engineers, we have architects, we have a lot of experience of prison design. And we go through workshops with people and help to facilitate some of those discussions around, have you thought about the staffing, the layout, the structure, the space, so a whole range of issues. So it's certainly something we do in the region. And we can also, in some places we visit, and as part of our visits, we make comments about the design and whether any changes are necessary. But it's not just about the physical design of prisons, it's also about the capacity for things like water, capacity for sewerage and wastewater, for electricity, for getting fresh water into the prison. So the prison design construction is one element, but all the support services that go with it are just as important, if not more important. Yes, I'll leave it there and hand back to you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
Next question is from.
Selanjutnya siapa, Mbak?
Sorry, facilitator. I think there are some questions on the chat box. I think they came earlier, so perhaps they can also answer some questions from the chat box. I think there's like one long question that would be quite interesting for Dr. Brian to answer it. So I think the question is from K, UIK. Can you see the question, Dr. Brian?
I do. Does somebody want to read it so that everyone? I understand it. I'm not sure everyone else does.
Okay. Sorry. Can I read it, facilitator, presenter? Is that okay for this one?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. So Kay wrote that I was wondering about the present problems brought by imprisonment-oriented criminal law enforcement have resulted in an overcrowding that has pushed Indonesia to an extreme point with 188% overcrowding. The situation has created various problems ranging from escaping of convicts and detainees from a prison riots, drug circulation controlled from prisons set ablaze by inmates, to illegal levies taken by prison officers, and various other problems. Although the problem has been lasting for years, Indonesia hasn't found yet the right formulation to overcome those problems. In your opinion, other than the flaw in the law and enforcement, what might be the core causes or cause of these long-lasting problems? And what is the best way to alleviate a prison overcrowding? Okay, so over to you.
Thank you. That's a great question and something I could launch into a 3-hour lecture on, which I've done elsewhere, on what are the causes and solutions to prison overcrowding. I won't do it today. I'm happy to come back and do that some other time. But yeah, I mean, I think the points you made in your comment were absolutely right. So, and I touched on them earlier as well. So overcrowding in a prison makes that prison inhumane in a lot of cases. So it makes it hugely challenging for prison authorities to meet the minimum standards on food, water, space, time out of room, family visits, constructive activities. And that's something not just seen in Indonesia, but seen in many countries in the region, in the Asia region. And I think a number of countries have now recognized that that situation can't go on, and are taking a number of different steps to try and deal with the issue of overcrowding. So trying to mitigate the impact is the first step. So try and reduce, so far as possible, the bad conditions. So other things that can be done from a design point of view. And again, ICRC is working in a number of countries to help those countries mitigate the impact of overcrowding. I think the second element is around diverting people from the prison system. And that can be diverting them from the prison system at the pre-trial stage through an increased use of bail, to diverting them at the sentencing stage if they're found guilty, to community punishments, to non-custodial measures. And I think there are so those are options, looking at non-custodial measures, looking at community punishments, looking at greater use of bail. Another one is looking at speeding up the criminal justice system so that people are not spending a very long time on pre-trial detention. And in many countries in the region, 75%, 80% of detainees are pre-trial. So they're just waiting to go to court to have their case heard. And that can, in some cases, go on for many years. So one of the projects we've just been doing in Cambodia, for example, is working with the Ministry of Justice on how they can speed up the judicial process, and what that actually means in terms of maybe getting judges to go to the prisons, getting a greater focus, looking at working with the police around evidence provision, witness provision. So a range of different things about speeding up justice process so that people are not spending a long time in pre-trial. And also, for example, making the use of bail the presumption. So the assumption is that people will get bail unless there are reasons to lock them up during the pre-trial period. And again, it depends on legislation. And in some countries, we worked with the government on legislation, commenting on legislation about increasing the use of bail within the country. But all of that needs to be done in partnership with the community, so the community understands what is going on. There's certainly been a pushback in some countries to community punishment, thinking that people, well, they didn't go to prison, so therefore they're not being punished. And explain to people that there can be an element of punishment in the community sentence, so community service, building things, constructing things, repairing things, painting things, picking up litter, a whole range of different activities that can be done in the community as punishment, rather than locking somebody up in a prison. So there are a whole range of different things that can be done, and there are examples around the world where countries have successfully reduced overcrowding, reduced their prison populations. But as I said, that's a subject to another one-day or half-a-day workshop, which I'm sure we could facilitate if we're interested. Okay, back to you, facilitate. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for answering the question. Next question is from Dr. Pratmono. The question is, Are there any instruments that can be used to measure the fulfillment of the standard minimum rules or other standards? And is there an instrument as well that measures the readiness of a curtain prison in reaching the mentioned standard? There is a question.
Okay, I don't quite understand the question. Could we get some clarification, please? I don't know, the person who asked the question, if they could come online and perhaps clarify what they meant, that would be very useful.
Perhaps facilitator can invite the person to take the floor to ask, if that's possible. Or maybe we can go with other questions while waiting. Okay, because there are like a lot of questions actually, and then I found one that is quite interesting. So it's from Farid Susanta, and he asked, in the perspective of ICRC, from the perspective of ICRC, there are like a lot of prisons in the worldwide, right?
Negara manakah yang sudah memenuhi standar seperti yang Anda bisa lihat di kolom chat, Ibu dan Bapak?
Mandela rules that you can, I don't know, consider as a model or something.
Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting question.
Terima kasih pertanyaan yang sangat menarik. Ya, mungkin tidak banyak sih negara yang memang benar-benar
countries that completely comply with all elements of the Nelson Mandela rules. And part of that is because of national legislation in some countries. I think in all the prisons I've seen in this region, there are some really good elements. So I think if I was able to create a new country and pick from each of the different prison systems in the region, I think there's enough in Asia to create a good model prison system. I think there are a lot of challenges for the different countries, and part of that, as I said, is overcrowding. Part of that is resourcing, how much money goes into the prison system. Part of that is, I think, in the region, the challenge around very old legal framework. So a lot of places are still using old colonial prison laws rather than more modern prison laws, and SOPs, and regulations. And I think in some cases it's around the training academy having a very old curriculum. So it's great to be able to be invited today to the academy to be able to talk about modern prison standards. That shows great foresight and great enthusiasm by the academy. So I commend you for that. So the short answer is, I would not want to point to any country in Asia and say that's a perfect prison system. Everywhere has challenges. I think if you look at some more Western European countries, they are closer to Mandela rules, but they have a very different approach to imprisonment. And where you imprison a very low number of detainees, it's much easier to provide very constructive activities. So in some Western European countries, there is a big probation system, there's a big community punishment system. So they literally only incarcerate, put into prison, people who've done very, very serious crimes. Everyone else serves their punishment in the community in a different ways, through electronic tagging or community punishment, community service. But those are very well-resourced prison systems that have very new buildings in a lot of cases. So I certainly would not point to those as being a model, and they would not be appropriate for the Asian culture. I've been working in Asia now for 5 years, and where Asian prisons are different to European prisons or American prisons, and many Asian prisons are much better than things I've seen in Europe and America. So I think there are challenges, but I think Asia can create good, compliant prisons with good staff, good resources, and a good legal framework. Okay, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the great answer. So next, there is some other question. There is some in the chat. Izin Pak untuk Bapak Imanuddin Hamzah, bisa untuk unmute.
Oke, ya. Sudah terdengar suaranya? Apakah terdengar?
Terdengar, Pak.
Oh ya, terima kasih. Okay, the Honorable, my friends, Miss Namira, and Dr. Shane Bryan, and Mr. Benoit, yang kami hormati juga rekan-rekan dosen maupun juga para taruna sekalian. Mr. Bryan, I'm interested in some experience in prison management that you explained. My question, I focus on mental health in prison, Mr. Bryan. In Indonesia, mental health problems in prison have not good attention, even though the mental health of prisoner is the key to preventing recidivism and successful reintegration. Can you give an overview of mental health program in other countries that are quite successfully implemented in the ICRC experiences? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. That's a really interesting question, really interesting area around mental health in prison. I think you're right. It's not received a lot of focus in Asia. I think when I've been visiting prisons, must have visited at least 12, maybe more countries in Asia, prison systems. You don't see a lot of psychologists, you don't see a lot of psychiatrists, you don't see a lot of training for prison staff on mental health conditions. I think there are certain of professional staff. I think where there aren't the professional psychiatrists, psychologists, some prison systems provide training for prison staff, for prison guards, in areas of, they're not going to do treatment, but they can help to identify the problems and they can help to manage the problems, because quite often what you see is detainees with mental health problems just isolated, put into solitary confinement or separated from the rest of the population, or in some places, attacked by the rest of the population who don't understand their behavior if the mental health issues result in what would be considered abnormal behavior. So I think it is a huge issue. A very high percentage of detainees in the region are in prison for drug-related offences. So in some cases that's drug use or drug dealing, or in some cases it's much more serious, international drug gangs. But I don't see a lot of treatment programs for detainees in prison. And I said that the overall percentage in the region, I think, is 65–70% of detainees are in prison for drug-related offending. And again, from a mental health point of view, drug addiction requires appropriate treatment, and there's not a lot of that happening in prisons in the region. So I think it is a challenge. I think it's one of the topics that ICRC has now started to work on, and we've just appointed a specialist advisor in my team in Bangkok who will who's responsible for mental health and psychological services. So again, there's a good resource there that we're able to tap into now to provide examples to prison authorities who are interested in what programs are available. I think there's a range of offending behavior treatment programs, so anger management, domestic violence, sexual offending programs that can be put into prisons if you've got the resources to be able to deliver those. On a positive element, we don't see much suicide and self-harm in prisons in Asia, which is a really big issue in American and Western European prisons. And I think part of that is is the different culture. I think part of that is also detainees being in accommodation that's dormitory and group accommodation rather than individual cells as well. So it's certainly something we can follow up on if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brian.
Thank you, sir. Excuse me, before I call the next person to ask question, how many more questions are you willing to answer on your time frame?
Let's go for 3 more questions. 3 is a good number.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I will call the next question. There is some izin Pak Ali Muhammad, bisa unmute.
Terima kasih, Mbak.
Ya, Pak.
Thank you, Mr. Brian. Saya menggunakan bahasa Indonesia untuk menanyakan tentang isu ini. Izin ya. Pertama, mencermati apa yang disampaikan oleh Dr. Brian tentang prinsipal atau prinsip-prinsip dasar di Mandela Rules, terutama di aturan keempat, di mana hakikat tujuan dari penghukuman adalah untuk memastikan masyarakat terlindungi dan memastikan juga resiko-resiko reoffending atau pengulangan pidana juga bisa ditekan sekecil mungkin dari si pelaku pelanggar hukum. Nah, untuk itu di aturan keempat prinsip dasar Mandela Rules menjelaskan bahwa administrasi lapas harus kuat memberikan dukungan kebutuhan dasar termasuk kebutuhan program untuk mencapai tujuan tadi. Di Indonesia saat ini kita mengalami kondisi masalah untuk bagaimana kemasyarakatan Indonesia memiliki kemampuan menyiapkan sejumlah kebutuhan dasar untuk narapidananya, baik itu kesehatan, pendidikan, termasuk program-program intervensi yang disebabkan oleh ketidakmampuan dukungan penganggaran maupun dukungan yang terkait dengan kebijakan langsung untuk penanganan itu. Nah, terkait dengan hal ini, Dr. Brian, saya minta perspektif Anda bagaimana negara lain memberikan dukungan penguatan administrasi lapas sehingga memiliki kemampuan yang seimbang untuk mencapai tujuan dari penghukuman itu sendiri. Karena di Indonesia saat ini Direktorat Jenderal Pemasyarakatan tidak memiliki kewenangan utuh untuk menyiapkan sejumlah kebutuhan itu. Karena struktur organisasi juga berpengaruh dalam proses pemenuhan kebutuhan-kebutuhan itu. Nah, dari perspektif itu mohon penjelasan bagaimana di Inggris atau mungkin di Kanada atau berdasarkan pengalaman Dr. Brian. Terima kasih.
Thank you. Yes, that's I mean, funding is a challenging issue, and I think I never had enough money when I was a prison director, and I don't think I've ever visited a prison system anywhere in the world who said I have enough money. I think the same would be said in all prison administrations. You know, we know what we should be doing. We know we can have a positive impact on people's lives, stop them reoffending if you give us the right resources. So I think it's a good challenge. It's a policy one. It's for your government to decide how much money they want to put into the prison system and what it considers to be the purpose of the prison system. And it's not for ICRC to tell a government what their policy, what their law, what their funding should be. Other than to say, it's quite clear if a government decides to put somebody into prison, they then take on the duty to look after that person and to treat that person with humanity. And international law is very clear that if a government, if somebody's put into prison in a country, then the government is responsible for making sure that they have all the basic necessities. So they do have food, water, healthcare. So that's very clear in international law, and the courts, international courts, have reinforced that and said that where that's not not taking place, and the government is culpable and not meeting the international standard. I think a second point for me is also the relationship between the prison administration and other ministries. And again, I'm not familiar enough, my apologies, with Indonesia, but again, in some countries, the ICRC have helped to facilitate conversations with Ministry of Finance, with Ministry of Health, with Ministry of Education, Ministry of Employment and Work, to get those ministries to support the prison system. So the Ministry of Health then provides all the medical staff and medications, but the Ministry of Work and Employment provides the teachers and the vocational training, but the Ministry of Education provides teachers to the prisons. And again, I say I'm not familiar enough, my apologies, with Indonesia, but one of the things we've done elsewhere, which has worked, is supporting the prison administration based on the evidence we've gathered through our prison visits, to actually go with the prison authorities to other ministries to help convince them to support, and then help to facilitate MOUs, memorandum of understanding, or some sort of agreements between the different ministries to provide education, work, healthcare within prisons. So that's option 2. I think option 3 is an interesting one, and some prison systems around the world now are trying to be self-sufficient, so don't actually want to be taking money from the government to run the prison. So they're actually looking at creating prison industries, prison workshops, growing their own food, raising their own cattle, fish, sheep, pigs, cows, growing their own rice, etc., so that increasingly they're not reliant on the government or the prison administration to fund them. Some prison administrations have reached an agreement with the government provision of activities in prison that then can supply government ministries. So one country, for example, makes all the furniture for all government ministries, the tables, the chairs, and then gets the money from those ministries come back into the prison department. Another country does all the laundry, the sheets, the bedding, the towels for all the hospitals. And again, that's a contract between the prison administration and other ministries. So again, the money for that doesn't go to the private sector, to business, it goes back to the prison administration. So there are an increasing number of countries around the world that do that. And of course, the great advantage for the prison is one, it gets the money, 2, it's got positive occupations, employment for detainees who are also able to benefit by some of that money as well. So it's not always just about getting the money from the government, and prisons can become, as I said, more self-sufficient, again, provided the legal framework is there to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, sir. Now we will give one student their chance to ask the question. So from Poltekip Rahmat Syahputra, silahkan untuk di-unmute.
Thank you for the moderator who has given me time to ask Mr. Dr. Shane Bryan. Good afternoon, all the participants. Before I deliver my question, let me introduce myself first. My name is Rahmat Syahputra. I'm the second year cadet at the Corrections Polytechnic. So this question is for Mr. Dr. Shane Bryan. From your explanation before, I have heard that the prisoners deserve to get contact with outside, with their families and their friends. But for the extraordinary criminals, I mean for the criminals who have done very serious crimes, they usually put in the higher security level of the cells. I mean, they must live alone in one cell for one man. They cannot communicate with their friends. They cannot meet with their families. They cannot get contact with the outside because they have the higher risk with the other prisoners. so they are easier to escape, or etc. For example, for the drug dealers and then human trader, or etc. So from the ICRC perspective, so what should the prison or the correctional center do? Extraordinary criminals, so that we can give them full attention for the security without avoiding the humanity. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You broke up a little, but I think I understood the key point around maintaining family contact for higher security, higher risk detainees. The starting point has to be one of risk assessment. In some countries, the law specifies what the standard is, so then there is no discretion for the prison administration. But the vast majority of countries allow the risk assessment to be done by the prison authorities. And managing prisons is around reducing risk. So most prisoners, most detainees, there is no problem with them having contact with their families by telephone or contact visits where they can touch the family during a visit. That does not create a security risk. Now, if as part of that someone is found or assessed to be a security risk, they've tried to smuggle drugs into prison, they've tried to contact gang members in the community, then appropriate and necessary measures and restrictions need to be put in place. But those restrictions should only be those that are absolutely necessary. So, for example, my last prison where I was the prison director in charge of the prison was a maximum security, a high security prison in England that held terrorist prisoners. Now, the visiting family contact was more restricted for those, rightly so, because there were reasons for that. But we still enabled them to have, still enabled the detainees to have visits, but those visits were not contact visits. They took place behind a glass panel. They could still talk to their family on the telephone, but there was a prison officer, prison guard listening to that telephone call. So we were monitoring everything that was said, and it was recorded, and they knew we were listening, and they knew that we would hand that recording over to the police. So again, we enabled the family contact, so there was still contact, but it was more restricted based on the risk related to security. So it's important that we comply with the Mandela rules, the UN standard minimum rules, but from a security point of view, we quite often have to put in place restrictions, but only restrictions that are absolutely necessary. And again, there are different examples in the region where high security and maximum security detainees still have contact with their families through visits or telephone calls, but those are restricted, those are monitored closely. There may be a prison guard during the visit monitoring what's said. There may be a prison guard listening in on the telephone. There may be a prison guard reading the letters, any correspondence that is going out or coming into the prison. So again, we should still maintain family contact, but that might be with restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for answer. Unfortunately, we have one slot left question, although your participation is very much appreciated. So lastly, one question from a correctional polytechnic coach. Izin Bapak Eka bisa di-unmute. Izin Pak, Pak Eka, izin Pak.
So no response from Bapak Eka. So perhaps we can go to the Q&A chat box again. It seems like Pak Eka is not present, right? Or Mbak MC, so do you want to take the question from the because there's no other attendees that want to ask? Oh, there's one. Yeah, okay.
There is some other question. From Bapak Mitro Subroto. Bagaimana bila suatu negara tidak mematuhi standar-standar minimal PBB?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so as I said at the beginning, the Nelson Mandela rules, the UN standard minimum rules, are guidance for authorities, for prison authorities. So they're not mandatory. It's not a legally enforceable covenant or convention. So it's not an international law. So the Nelson Mandela rules is not law. It's merely advice and guidance for countries. It's quite often used in courts as the international standard. So it has a bit of a legal reference, but it's certainly not an international law. And as I said at the beginning, it's something that all countries approved. To be very clear, General Assembly approved the Nelson Mandela rules. So they have been endorsed by all UN members. But it's aspirational. It's something that UN members have been encouraged to try and get to that minimum standard. And not all places at all times are able to achieve those minimum international standards. I think countries in the region are trying to get there. A lot of effort is going into meeting those minimum standards. The ICRC, in our confidential dialogue with prison authorities, will highlight where the country is not meeting the minimum standard and basic humanitarian conditions. We will say that to the authorities privately, confidentially, and then work with authorities to try and meet those minimum standards. But we would not publicly condemn a country for not meeting the minimum standards. So that's about the Mandela rules. I think the international law element, and we haven't gone into international human rights law today, that's another lecture. Where that is breached, then there are various enforcement mechanisms where citizens of countries can take their government to international bodies, UN Human Rights Council and others, to say that the minimum standards are not being met, that the law has been broken. And that's particularly around things like torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, lack of food, lack of water. So there are international mechanisms around conventions and covenants, but not about the UN standard minimum rules, which are guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the answer.
This meeting is being recorded.
Answer and question due to our time frame, we have to end the Q&A session. So this is the end of Q&A session. Thank you for asking, and thank you as well for answering Dr. Brian's. Okay, now I will pass the microphone back to Ahmad Gunawan. Thank you for listening.
Baiklah, terima kasih saya ucapkan kepada Anissa Dewi yang telah memandu acara kita pada siang hari ini dengan sangat baik. Terima kasih juga kepada Direktur Politeknik Ilmu Pemasyarakatan, para pejabat struktural dan fungsional, Bapak Ibu dosen, para pembina beserta jajaran Sivitas Akademika Politeknik Ilmu Pemasyarakatan yang telah berkenan untuk hadir dalam acara ini. To conclude this event, as Master of Ceremony, I want to once again express our very special thanks and gratitude towards Dr. Brian for sparing his valuable hours of his for our lifetime work of knowledge. Thus, I hope this event can provide meaningful insight for all of us. Terima kasih kepada Badan Pembinaan Ideologi Pancasila Republik Indonesia, Balai Pemasyarakatan Yogyakarta, mahasiswa umum, dan seluruh peserta yang telah berpartisipasi dalam public lecture ini. Kembali kami ingatkan kepada seluruh taruna untuk dapat mengisi link absen yang telah kami bagikan. Link absen akan kami tutup tepat 1 jam setelah acara selesai dari sekarang. Saya Ahmad Gunawan, mewakili panitia yang bertugas mengucapkan terima kasih kepada seluruh peserta yang telah berpartisipasi dalam acara ini. Dan mohon maaf apabila terdapat kesalahan baik kata maupun tindakan. Buah nanas, buah ceri, dicampur gula, enak sekali. Saya akhiri acara hari ini. Semoga bisa bertemu lagi di kemudian hari. Wabillahi taufik wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Saturday nights